You a beer lover? You thinking about getting into development? How do those two things actually match up? I think you're about to find out, because this is a story about Darin Haener, how he became the president and co-founder of FermentAble. How do you go from brewer to software developer and founder? This is the journey. Let's check it out right now. Whoa, welcome back, folks. Thank you for watching and listening. I'm really excited because I'm getting a ton of feedback that you're loving the video versions of these podcasts. This was a bit of a replay. A recent episode I had featured Darin Haener. He's the president and co-founder of FermentAble LLC. They run software about creating better flow management for brewers. So if you're into beer and you want to learn about craft beer, we dive in hard on all sorts of stuff around the brewing experience, about how craft beer became a thing, what it is, what software development means to somebody who had never done it before, how Darren made the jump from beer lover to software developer. We talk about Ruby on Rails. We talk about tons of stuff. Darren's a really, really great person. I enjoyed this show, and I hope you enjoy it. Oh, that's right. If you want to see more great stuff like this, of course, make sure you do that thing. You click on that nice little button over there that says subscribe. You click the little belly ding icon, and then the bell ding icon tells you when new things come up. Drop a comment below if you want to see more great stuff like this. I love hearing your feedback. Let's jump in. This is Darin Haener of FermentAble on Bootstrapping, and let's get it started right now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Darin Haener. I'm the president and co-founder of FermentAble, and you're listening to the DiscoPosse podcast.
Thing of beauty. You've done this before. You're a pro.
A few times.
Well, Darren, we got a chance to start talking right before the mics went up, and I always laugh when I get this convergence of all the things I've ever experienced in life when you meet somebody and you know, I'm going to have an amazing conversation with them. Number one, you're doing really neat stuff in what your company's doing. Number two, you come from a really neat background in that it's not an automatic fit necessarily. So we'll talk about what your technology background led you to, the brewing and the technology, where those two things came together. Because quite often as well, just the career spans a lot of different functions of our lives. So I love that your story brought those things together. But anyways, you've got a really great story. And so before people get to know you, let's just give you a quick introduction. Tell us about you, where we can connect with you online as well, if folks want to chat and talk more about you. And then we'll talk about FermentAble and all the good stuff you're doing there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the great intro, Eric. I am a founder of a software company, a SaaS-based software company for breweries. I am a former brewer, and I am currently a technologist. So my company is my side business actually right now. So yeah, I got a lot on my plate.
Well, and I guess this is what I really enjoy about the way that this stuff comes together, because quite often when you hear people and you can even sort of hear the way you describe yourself as a founder, it's almost like, yeah, I am a founder, but like it's a real neat responsibility when you're getting ready to, you're building a company, you're building a platform, and you're still maintaining, day-to-day operations at another organization or a company. People have families, all this. It's not an easy thing. Like just getting through your day as a founder is not easy, especially when you're in the balancing act of doing other things. But I think we should talk about FermentAble to start off, because anybody, they're going to lock in on why this is pretty cool.
Yeah, cool. So FermentAble is brewery management software. We really target small breweries, which is really the largest section.
Yeah, the irony that's if you put them all together, it's like the RC Cola of there's a lot of them, right? And if you took a look at the total size of the market, it's probably a pretty heavy percentage.
Yeah, so our target audience is I don't know the exact numbers, but it's upwards of like 95% of of the breweries.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Take that, Anheuser-Busch.
That's right. That's right. And it was really born out of frustration when I left the brewing industry. So I left brewing in 2007. So I've been out of it for a while, but at the end of my run as a brewer there, it was I was managing multiple breweries, and I was spending so much time just doing paperwork. And I was trying to manage everything with spreadsheets, and I was just like, why am I doing this? This is 2007. Like, there's got to be software for this, and there wasn't. So, fast forward a few years, I transitioned into software and started looking at doing my own thing, and here I am. There's a lot more to unpack, but
the funny thing is, it's the perfect story because the most successful startups are founded on somebody having a very specific problem that they want to solve. And then they realize that there's another audience of people who share this problem. That ultimately is and like you said, there is a weird, unfortunate human capability to withstand a lot of pain and live through weird processes. So when you come along with something that can take first principles type of approaches and we can solve this a lot faster, it's a real wow moment.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was talking to someone last week about that very thing. Your tolerance to pain, right? And the analogy I used was the old frog in frog or lobster in a pot of water. If you put it in cold and slowly turn the heat up, they don't notice. They just cook to death. Yeah. Whereas you throw it in hot, what is wrong, right? So I do find that a lot in this industry where people have been doing things for so long in a specific way that it's really hard they don't know how much pain they're in. They don't know how much process can be automated for them and how much time they're wasting in their day-to-day operations and planning. And that's a really hard bridge to gap.
Yeah. If you think about, as you look at, this is why software development, and you look at all the methodologies, right? We hear the use of phrases like user stories, and why is it important? Because that's ultimately what we're doing. And I actually love that more people are adopting Agile as a methodology, or just like Scrum or whatever all the different methodologies are, but they start to use the same phrasing. Whereas before it was feature, milestone. It doesn't really emote that this means something to the person that's using this product, versus I can solve a problem that a user has, and this is how we're going to solve it through a feature build.
Right. So that kind of classic user story language, or as a user, I want to do X, right?
Right.
So I found it when I was building the software, I wasn't very keen on the Agile processes. I was still a very new developer in the software world. And I really knew nothing about it, but looking back, that was my mindset, because I'd worked in a brewery for a decade. And so, I was coming at it from that perspective. As a brewer, I want to be able to schedule my beers and change my mind without having to erase an entire whiteboard. Right?
That's right.
So I was doing that without even knowing
it. I think that's probably the best way to be agile. And I've worked with a lot of developers, and this idea of value is in the output, not in the framework. Sticking to the framework becomes the thing you do more than caring about the quality of the user story coming into it. And we often get wrapped in this problem of are you agile? And I used to joke, said you talk to developers and they've got different ways they do things, and it becomes an argument of, are you agile enough? Our team's more agile than you are because we do dailies, and this is not how we should measure the success of a development team. It should be who uses the bloody product at the end.
Yeah, I know. It's funny when you see people getting so caught up like you said, in the framework and not on outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I think, you familiar with, what's the OKR book?
Oh yeah, the Google one
Inspired.
from
No,
yeah.
Inspired.
Oh, okay.
Marty Kagan's book.
Yeah.
That's a great read for anyone out there who hasn't read it. But it kind of teaches you to focus more on outcomes rather than what you were talking about, framework,
Yeah.
right? And we don't really care how we get there, right? We just know that we're trying to get this outcome, and you can empower your team or yourself to get there in whatever works best for you, whether that's agile, whether that's the base camp style of shaping up projects, or waterfall. I mean, if waterfall works for you, use it. I mean,
worked for Niagara Falls for a long time. And waterfall's not a terrible thing. Yeah.
No.
Well, and I like that you will get into some of your development history, because I'm going to nerd out on your choice of a framework. Speaking of frameworks, I'm a hack coder myself, mostly hack, definitely not code. Because I came from an ops background, and then I worked in an organization, and I supported a development team. And the first thing I always think is, how do I be a better purveyor of things if I don't know my customer? My customer is the development team sitting beside me. And all of a sudden, I had this new developer that came onto the team, and he was using this nifty little thing that I'd never heard of called Ruby on Rails. Mm-hmm. And so, we were a Java shop, and that's how you describe it. Like, we're a Java shop. So thus everything must be written in Java. It gets converted from whatever to Java. And all of a sudden this Ruby on Rails stuff shows up. And he's got a Mac. Everybody else has got a Windows machine. It was like, oh, how did this happen? We let a fox into the developer hen house.
Yeah, where'd this guy come from?
But what was neat was, in order to support that team, what I did was I started to learn how to build and learn how to design, and he showed me, and then they hired a couple more developers, and I started really learning. And I took all of my systems that I used for my internal ops functions, and I wrote them in Ruby on Rails so that I could, build inventory management systems and patch management systems for our servers and stuff like that, because it let me, live the experience that they were living, and then going through my own processes with it, which was neat. And then I started going into, I'm like, why aren't more people using this stuff? It's fantastic. Because it was a really great platform. And then I started, following Jason Fried, of course, and David Haener Hampson, and really, really wild stuff. But I liked I'll say sort of the aggressive anti-patterns that they adopted that ultimately become patterns. So there's a weird irony in if you try to be so anti-pattern, you have to create a pattern that's anti-pattern.
Right. I think their deal is kind of, you can sum up the Ruby on Rails framework as, when you start building a piece of software, there's so many decisions you have to make, right? Like, you have to decide, what kind of database you're going to use, how do you architect, how do you talk to the database? Are you going to use this ORM or that ORM or a different one? Like, all these different things. And Rails is just opinionated, and they're like, look, this is how you do it. Yeah. And you don't have to make those decisions, right? You can just start producing value immediately within about 5 minutes, really. As long as it takes to bundle install, you can be creating something worth value to someone. So
what I've always enjoyed too, when you get, when we look at different frameworks, and it becomes almost a bit of a religious discussion as to which one people choose. And I laugh, because of the argument I would get when I still develop with Ruby on Rails. I just did a Rails new on a new project yesterday, in fact. And people always say, well, I hear it doesn't sort of perform at scale. And I tell them, like, where do you store your code? And they're like, on GitHub. I'm like, I think it operates okay at scale. Guess what it's written on?
It's Rails. It's Rails. And with the advent of technologies like Kubernetes, you can scale horizontally. You just fire up as many containers as you want with a push of a button. And then your scale problems becomes, can your database handle all these connections, right?
Right. Yeah.
But if you get there, like, that's a really good problem to have. You're doing something right if you reach that point. So
your development and brewing, tell me about the timeline. Where did one happen? And obviously there's a passion for both, and they probably both preceded your jobs doing either of those particular things.
Yeah, that's true. So I'll date myself a little bit here. The first computer I got was an IBM PS2 back in, God, I don't know, 80. Let's see, I was 12 years old, so I had to be like 87, 88-ish. And it had one disk drive, and if I wanted to run a program, I had to load up DOS on one disk. I had my DOS disk, and then I had to like put a different disk in to load that up. Just swapping 3.5-inch floppies.
Yes, right.
And so I fell in love with programming basically as soon as I discovered BASIC on that little IBM PS2. And then, fast forward to high school, I learned Pascal. I took a Pascal and AP Pascal class as a freshman and a sophomore. And then I was done at high school. Like, there was no more computer science for me at high school. Because it was still, this was in the early 90s. So there was almost nothing available.
That's what's funny to think of. Like, I don't want to be the like get off my lawn technology guy to the young kids these days, but people don't realize sometimes that, like, I took typing class in high school. I was the only boy in the typing class, and we were on IBM Selectric typewriters. Like, we didn't even have computers. We had Icons was the like school computer, which it was like, but yeah, there was no programming track. It wasn't even a matter of like, oh, darn, you've got to learn, you're not learning Objective-C. Instead, you're learning old school, programming styles. You're like, no, there's nothing. There is no programming at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's kind of where it ended for me as far as learning goes. And the internet was at that point in its infancy. I think I had to pay America Online by the minute to be on the internet. That's
right.
and you can't just hop on to Udemy and take a coding class back then, right? So I kind of drifted away from technology at that point, and graduated high school, lost interest in college completely. Like, this is not for me. I've had enough of school. And I just started working, and ended up working in a restaurant, like a college dropout does, right? and found myself on disability. Broke my arm playing basketball. Found myself on disability and with nothing to do, just sitting around the house, nothing to do. And I had been working at the only local brew pub in town. There's just one. I was working there, and so I had my interest in beer had been piqued at that point. I had tried some Sierra Nevada, I'd tried some of their beer, and so I was interested in this whole craft brew thing, which this was like 1996. It was still.
It was a very unique thing, right? It was super out on its own at that time.
Yeah, I mean, out here in California, it was Sierra Nevada, Anchor Steam, and Samuel Smith's, right? They imported Samuel Smith's. So those were like the three things you could find reliably.
Yeah.
So not a lot of variety. And so I was interested in it. And so while I had this time off, there's a home brew shop down the street that I could walk to. Serendipity, I guess. And so as a 19-year-old, I went in there and I bought homebrewing ingredients with my disability checks. And apparently that's legal because it's not actually alcohol. It's just the ingredients.
True. Yeah, it's only ingredients. That's interesting. I forgot about that.
Yeah. So, I started brewing beer and immediately fell in love with it. Just the process, the science, the chemistry, everything about it. And I like beer, it turns out, you know.
It's a beautiful pairing.
Yeah. So, you know, I did that, and I found a way to do it with one broken arm with a cast up to my shoulder. So right there, that tells me like I'm passionate, right? And so that kind of catalyzed my my re-entry into software a little bit, as I hadn't really done anything in many years. But I had no, I didn't have a laptop. I had a desktop back then. I think laptops were really a thing yet.
Yeah, still newish at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a desktop and I had Microsoft Visual Basic. And, you know, when you're brewing beer, you have to record a lot of data. There's a lot of, you know, temperatures that you have to hit just right in order for things to go right. And timing's important. Things like pH, and it's just a lot of data to record. And I was writing it down on paper, and that was the very first time that I thought there's got to be software for this.
Yeah.
But there really,
better way.
There really wasn't. So I started and never finished writing kind of homebrew management software in Visual Basic, which I think I was doing it more just to play with Visual Basic than to actually complete the project. I realize in hindsight, but so yeah, did that and went back to work. And when I went back to work, I was able to get on as the prep cook, meaning I worked the same hours as the brewer does. And, you know, I had in my mind, like, I'm going to get a job working in the brewery, like working the same hours as the brewer. It was convenient to walk in. I had to walk through the brewery to get to the walk-in. And so I was going back and forth, hauling lettuce and everything else back and forth. And so I essentially just bothered him for about 18 months, bringing him my beers, trying to talk to him about beer. I think I just annoyed him to death until he finally just gave me a job. And so I started brewing professionally, right, not too long after I turned 21.
Nope. Now that was an interesting thing too, because at the time, like you said, there's a lot of obviously there's a huge amount of science to it, and it's a combination of science and then, you know, human behavior and like what will be good at the time, and, you know, what will people enjoy, you know, which is, you know, we see it often with the sort of the trends that will roll through the brewing and the wine industry. You know, my dad was he worked as a tour guide at Jackson Triggs Winery in Niagara Falls. And he said you could tell that sideways was becoming a thing because everybody was coming in asking if we had a Pinot Noir. And he's like, you know, that's basically like the PBR of wine, right? Like this is not a good type of wine, but because it got a mass market appeal, you know. So it was neat that he would get those things and sort of the trends and the way that people would use it. But then at the same time, digging into the science of why one flavor is better or different than the other. And so at the same time, you don't really have internet. You don't have a lot of things. What kind of resources do you get to figure out how the hell you make a great beer?
It's hard. It was very hard back then. I mean, you had to rely on published books, right? You know, Charlie Papazian, who's a legend in home brewing, has a great book that still stood the test of time. It's still one of the most popular books. I'm having a hard time remember the other ones, but there were several very well-known books. And then, you know, there were also homebrew clubs were a great resource, right?
Nice.
I know in the city I grew up in Fresno, California, there was a great homebrew club. And yeah, I think it's pretty common because of that lack of access. Like, what do? Like, you know, well, you have a brew pub and you have a bunch of guys sitting around talking about beer. Like, hey, we should get together and homebrew and share recipes and share knowledge. And that really, I think that's still, even with the advent of technology and how easily information is accessible, I think that's still a really popular thing for homebrewers.
It's funny if you think about like all of if you take the industry out of it, if you take the name off the industry and you take what you just described, technology and brewing are pretty darn aligned, right? Like we have user communities, we have, resources, we've got sort of the Bibles of the things we've got, which would be like the pragmatic programmer and stuff like this. Like it is amazing that regardless of the industry, we do map to these same sort of behaviors and methods. It's funny when you hear it described, like the homebrew wasn't, in fact, I think like that was like the homebrew computing club. Wasn't that like the Steve Jobs Wozniak one where they actually
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, no, there's a lot of commonalities there for sure. And I would go so far even as to say, like, I have seen in both communities, like you can see kind of these different sects where, in the technology world, there's some communities that are very open and caring and kind, and there's some toxic ones, right?
Yeah.
There's just mean people out there, and you can kind of get yourself caught up with them accidentally sometimes. And I see the same thing in the brewing world. But I guess that's just kind of human nature, right? You just kind of see that everywhere you go.
But I do like that this is the natural formation of humans, in that we want to achieve something. We realize other people also want to achieve this thing. Let's share stories. It's a very sort of tribal behavior. And I love that it happens, because it means that you can basically democratize access to stuff. Like you don't need to have a university education in brewing science or whatever the background you would need as a true formal education for it. There's a lot of stuff that you can get that is, passed down through the ages and through your peer group.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And when you were talking about that, it kind of made me draw a line between open source software and the brewing industry, and how widely people share things. A good example, an easy example that I think everyone can probably relate to, was during all the California wildfires a couple years ago. Sierra Nevada brewed a beer, and then they took that recipe and they just sent it. They open sourced it basically and said, if you want to brew this beer and donate some of the proceeds to communities that have been hit hard by California wildfires, please do it. And it was very interesting.
That's really cool.
I was able to get my hands on several different iterations of it and do kind of a vertical tasting. And even though it's the same recipe, they were all different beers. They were similar. They were similar, but they were all had their own uniqueness to it. And because of that, like, the brewing community is typically very open. Like, here's my recipe. Like, what are you going to do with it? Like, you're not going to go monopolize like Anheuser-Busch with this, You'd be lucky to win a medal at the Great American Beer Festival with it. That's a crapshoot. Yeah,
if you took a Budweiser and poured it into a fancy glass and then called it this new age homebrew, it wouldn't necessarily, like, it's funny. I shouldn't. I picked the name and I shouldn't pick on it. I'll pick on a Canadian one. We'll call it, Labatt 50. So I was a kid and I grew up, and my dad drank Labatt 50, which is, I think it's not a Pilsner. I don't even know exactly what it is. Most people describe it as horse piss. It's a pretty horrifying beer, but I drank it as a kid, like as a young drinker, mainly because you would go to a party and you would get a bunch of Labatt 50. And you'd get back to the party after you left for a while, and they'd be like, oh, we're all out of beer. And I'd reach into the cooler and like, oh, darn it, let me get my empties out. And I would see like 5 left of my beer, going like, what do you mean we're out of beer? There's a bunch of Labatt 50 left here. And they're like, I said we were out of beer, not out of 50. So my dad actually drank it because he drank it in Montreal, and it was easy to say 50. Is the easiest French word you could learn. So that's where. So
that's interesting. Well, we have talked bad about Anheuser-Busch, and a lot of people do, but in all fairness, that is an incredibly hard beer to produce well and consistently, because it's so refined and
at scale, right? It's one thing
at scale.
To pull it off as one batch would be one thing, but you'd be lucky more than you'd be right on how you got it.
Yeah, well, they blend.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting process. Like the people that do this have probably the best palates in the world, but yeah, it's really hard to pull that off. You can brew a repeatable IPA very easily because there's so many hops, lots of malt to cover up any kind of defects that might happen in
You
the
can
brewing
kind of
process.
hide it a bit.
Yeah, no, yeah, but with Budweiser and all these light beers, like there's nothing there. There's nothing there to hide it. Like it has to be clean. It has to be very well done, and it's hard to do. So you have to give them their due. What they do is difficult.
I'm going to ask you a beer question because I'm curious.
Yeah, let's do it.
I hate IPAs. Like I for whatever reason, just it's a flavor or a style that just does not really sit well with my palate. And but I'm not I don't drink a lot and I haven't for quite a long time, but even for whatever reason, I just find it's just the flavor and there's a heaviness, there's something to it that doesn't really map to my palate. And it became a huge thing. Obviously IPAs were everywhere and they still are, in the same way that my dad would complain about the Pinot Noir. Somewhere along the line, and I think it was what Sam Adams was probably one of the ones that was kind of a real strong IPA. There was literally a brand in Canada, I don't know if there was down here, called IPA. It was like, that was literally the name of the beer, just an IPA on the front. And it was, but there's a reason why IPAs as a recipe exist. And then there's there's the mass adoption is a different thing. So why the hell does one need an IPA? I'm curious what the breakdown is of the ingredients.
Okay, so the name is quite literal, right? It's an Indian Pale Ale, right? Why is it called India Pale Ale? So back probably 1500s, 1600s, maybe. I don't have the exact dates in my head, but before refrigeration, let's just say that. So when Britain was still heavily colonized in India, they would send their ships down there and they would send beer, right? And they found that standard beers spoiled by the time they got there because no refrigeration, right? And so what they found was if you add more hops act as a preservative. So they would just load these things up with hops, just to
let it survive the trip, right? And not kill anybody who's drinking it.
Right. And so the other thing with hops is that bitterness that most people find offensive fades over time.
Right.
So a really fresh beer is going to be much more bitter than a beer that's been sitting on the shelf for 6 months, right? And so you'll often see on IPA bottles or cans like don't age this beer.
Yeah,
it's not for aging. Because along with the bitterness, you lose a lot of the aromas because it's basically essential oils that come out of the hop cone that give it these really nice aromatics. And they're volatile, right? They dissipate and their chemical structure is very delicate. And so it just falls apart. And it just becomes kind of a stale, boring beer after even a month. Like they're pretty,
it's
pretty volatile.
Pretty rapid turn. Yeah. Okay.
It is. Yeah. So IPAs you should consume fresh, but that's kind of the story behind how they got their name. Like everything we do in America, we've kind of turned it on its head and
now we've just made it popular with hipsters and then it took off.
You're not using it for its originally intended purpose, right?
That's right. Now, this is what, and so again, I use the words, but I don't even know really exactly what they are other than that it would say, the other one was Labatt Blue, which was like the most popular beer in Canada. And this is what's always funny to us that again, I totally take on the fact that I strung up Anheuser-Busch a couple of times in the chat so far, but we used to joke about Labatt Blue. Same thing. It was like, oh yeah, I would go as a kid because drinking age is 19, and let's just say for all intents and purposes, statute of limitation wore off. I can actually say it. I used to go to the beer store before I was 19, and you would go and if you ordered a Budweiser or Molson Canadian, which was a very popular beer, you'd get asked for ID. But if you asked for a case of Labatt Blue, they would never ask for your ID because there's no way this is for you, kid. This got to be for your dad. So they wouldn't think that it was for you. And it was a Pilsner, but it was the most popular beer in Canada. Even though we made fun of it and, it said, oh, it's my dad drinks it. Molson Canadian, one would think, because all the kids drink it, would be the best selling. And in fact, it wasn't the case.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that comes with perception.
Yeah.
I mean, and Anheuser-Busch is the number one, Budweiser is the number one selling beer here in the United States. And, that I could draw a lot of parallels to exactly what you just said. People look at it and, oh, it's Budweiser. There's all these craft beers over here. We're going to go buy those. And in your bubble, you don't see a lot of people buying Budweiser, but it's so easy to drink. Like it's just extremely popular.
Well, and the irony is that everything started as a craft brewery. It's just the difference is like sort of the definition of the size of it. And in fact, this was what, goodness gracious, what's the fellow from Sam Adams there? I can't remember his name.
Jim Cook.
Yes. Yeah. And it got to the point where he had to really kind of like lobby to try and still be considered a micro brewer for taxation and business purposes, because he was about to cross the chasm to a very expensive operating land because they were now brewing so many bottles. And I forget what the numbers, like millions of bottles.
Millions of barrels.
Yeah.
They make a lot of beer. And that's actually been, they're still kind of fighting that fight with the Brewers Association. Brewers Association, which is by no means like the law of the land, but they are kind of the de facto.
They're like the Teamsters of
like the de facto IRS, the brewing community, and they have defined like what a craft brewery is, and they've said, sorry, you're Sam Adams, you're no longer a craft brewery. You brew too much beer. Yeah. And so just that label means a lot, right? Setting the money thing aside, which is definitely an issue when you start getting that big. Just being able to put that on the label and having it mean something goes a long way.
Yeah, there's a regulatory thing that must be much different at that layer, and like you said, like that's when they go to that next level, it's no longer, now they're a mass market, and it probably takes it out of people's menu, if they say, this is just another brew.
It's a macro brew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then the funny thing is that just like software and technology and any other business, right, there's been a huge consolidation over the last decade and even further back, I think, as a lot of those microbreweries, got picked up and they're ultimately under, InBev and AB they themselves got collapsed down into each other. Yep. What's the Molson Coors? I forget who they are. They're probably all owned by InBev at this point as well.
I can't remember.
But I remember going like Blue Moon. That was a big thing, is people like, oh, I like this Blue Moon because it's a small, craft style, Belgian, wheat beer. And they're like, well, take a look at the back of the can now.
Yeah, I think they're owned by a rival large Belgian company. I can't remember what they're called, but yeah, I mean, lots of similarities there too. Like they're just buying back their market share, right? Yeah, they're like, oh, we lost 2% of the market to craft brews. How many of them can we buy up and just put under in our portfolio? And oftentimes they don't change anything about the way the company is run. Right. But when people hear that, they're like, "Oh, you sold out. I'm not going to buy your beer anymore."
I know, that's what's terrible too. Like even I'm a coffee drinker, as I'm like people seen on camera. I'm guzzling back a coffee in the afternoon, which is probably a fundamentally terrible idea. But like I'm a big fan of Blue Bottle coffee. I used to love going in when I go to San Francisco, and you go to Blue Bottle, and then they open one up in New York. So I would go to my office in New York. I'm like, "Oh, this is amazing. Go to Blue Bottle," and then they got bought by Nestle. And everybody's just like, looks like I'm never going to Blue Bottle again. I'm like, it's the same coffee. Like, they're just giving them access to distribution. They're keeping the company the same, but no one believes it. Like, they just think automatically, oh, they're going to get rolled in and change the flavor and change everything now, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting line to walk, right? Nestle and lots of other big companies have some controversial business tactics and decisions they've made, and it really just it becomes a personal decision at that point, because you're still putting money into Nestle's pocket, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it just becomes very personal at that point. And I try not to get too involved in those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like I said, it maps so beautifully to, the inside software, and so you decided to go the route. Look, I got to solve this problem. I can solve this problem. I've gotten a lot further than Visual Basic. You've built it. So, you put together Fermentable, and I applaud the approach, because one of the best things you can do is choose a specific niche that you have expertise in, and the audience, the customer, the pain. So when you go to tell them, you're not selling a better widget. You're literally like, no, I used to do this for a living, and I know this helped me, and this is what it means it can do for you. It's cool to see that you can do that. Who knows? One day you may get bought by Oracle. And then you'll be having that Nestle conversation. But in the meantime, I love microbreweries. I love startups. I love the fact that people can grassroots just solve a problem and then take it to the market and test it.
Mm-hmm.
So what did it feel like? What was your decision where you said, I think I've got a thing here?
Man, it was scary. Even though I was really I wasn't putting any money on the line. Really, you can go get a T1 micro instance from AWS for $10 a month or something, right?
SaaS and IaaS are a wonderful thing, aren't they?
Yeah. So it was I was maybe gambling a couple $100 a year,
Yeah.
But it was more putting myself out there, right? I was, when I broke ground and started writing code for Fermentable, I think I'd been writing code professionally for like 8 months. Wow. I still really didn't know what I was doing. And sometimes when I look back in the code base, it's very obvious. What was I thinking? God. But yeah, for me, that was the biggest thing, is just putting myself out there, right? Like, I didn't know barely knew how to write code and how to write an application that wasn't going to fall over all the time.
Yeah.
And I had no idea how to be an entrepreneur and how to start a business. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. And so just like, it was very overwhelming. Like you couldn't back then just log into Stripe and click a few buttons and have Stripe set your company up for you, right?
Right.
You couldn't do that. So I had to figure out, luckily I did have the internet by then. How do I form an LLC? How do I pay taxes?
Yeah.
How do I charge people? What do I charge people? Like, what is this product even worth? Like, that was probably one of the hardest things that I faced and still have trouble with is how much are people willing to pay for this? That's a very difficult question to answer.
I think that's, and it's funny, the real reason why startups struggle quite often is understanding how do you price the thing you do in relative value to what people will pay for, and find the top of that curve. And
Yep.
That's really what it is. You're either priced high and priced out and you run out of money, or so you don't find product market fit, or you run out of money. There's
Right.
like two kind of major, in fact, I think that's the only real technically two reasons why a company fails, is they either run out of money or they don't find product market fit, which is really actually running out of money.
Yes, it really is. It really is. And luckily for me, like again, like I started this thing on shoestrings with nothing, and really never purchased anything until the company had money in the bank account to buy it.
Yeah.
So I've never taken on any debt. Actually, up until this last year, I never took any money from it at all.
Oh, wow. Okay. So the true bootstrap story was
Yes.
there. Incredible.
Yeah. I mean, I will say,
and challenging. It's brave, right? It
is, but I could do it on my own terms and on my own time. Right. So I don't have any external forces pushing me to be growing at any kind of pace. Right. So it's much calmer than having that kind of environment. Right. But I will say, the first job that I got in tech, it was a bootstrap company. And so I kind of, everything I knew about being involved in a tech company was from that lens, right?
Yeah.
Do you know who, have you heard of Rob Walling? Microconf?
The name sounds familiar. I'm blurry because my children don't sleep. But yeah. But yeah. Sorry, keep going.
Well, yeah, look him up when you have some time. He's was a fantastic mentor to me and continues to be to this day. But he runs he bootstrapped all of his companies.
Okay.
The company that he hired me onto, my first job was in tech was it's called Drip. It's an email marketing platform, and he sold that to Lead Pages for I don't know how much, but it was a lot of money. And he could essentially be retired, but now he's doing angel investing and continuing to run his bootstrap SaaS conference kind of platform.
Unreal, eh?
But yeah, so I kind of, just to circle back on that, like I always saw starting a software company through that lens, right? So to me, it was never attractive to try to go out and raise money. And to be honest, it's scary and it stresses me out just thinking about it. Having those outside pressures pushing on you to get that return as fast as possible.
I think one of the things I really enjoyed was listening to Jason Fried did a few podcasts, and he was on a bunch of them, and he's like the same age range as you and I, and his stories of as a youth. And it's funny that we all kind of came to it. We arrived at a place where no one should have allowed us to get here. Like we got to an industry that almost didn't exist, which was the way that we bypassed the university path because it had just started. And then there was a period where you needed a CS degree to get even to get a desktop support job. And I managed to like sneak past it, or, people went the founder's route or different things. But it's the same thing. He talks about the not wanting the responsibility to the investors, because I'd rather disappoint an investor than a customer. And that clearly is not a good way to face your investors, right? So he and DHH, when they did Basecamp 37 Signals back in that day, they said, look, we know what you need to get. You're going to invest. You need an outsized return on this investment. You require growth targets. You require scaling. We're comfortable at the rate we're scaling. And, DHH drives a nice car. I imagine Jason does as well. And they've earned it. They really, and it's neat to see that they took on, it was both a responsibility to bootstrap, but also a comfort in that you have more control over the path and the trajectory of your company.
Yeah, absolutely. I am very big fans of theirs, if you couldn't tell already. Their book, Rework, their books Rework, Fantastic.
Yeah. What was the first one? So rework I did, and then there was the do they do remote?
Remote.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did remote. I haven't read that one. And they have another one that's more recent called Shape Up.
Yep.
That I absolutely love. Like, if there's one way I could pick to work in the software industry, it's like everything in that book resonated with me on such a deep level. It really just it kind of throws a middle finger up at Agile.
Yeah. The hardest part I found with it was I love when they published Shape Up as like a PDF and they started the blogs and they started talking about it. I was like, this is cool. And I was all in on it. The hardest thing I bump into, when we started talking about the start, was that the idea that the anti-pattern becomes a pattern. And so when you go to explain to somebody, how is it different than Agile? The first thing you have to do is create comparatives of like, well, a user story is this, and they've got a bet versus an epic. And when you start doing that, you're like, oh, now I'm turning it into a framework that's going to be, a thing I got to latch onto. But meanwhile, it is meant to be almost like the Agile manifesto. If you take all the crappy words around the framework away, the manifesto is what I love about Agile. The way people apply it and put a machine around it is like taking ISO and certifying the Agile manifesto, which is what I'm disappointed in.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I have to say, like, I don't know if I'm making this up or if this was like one of the first parts of the Shape Up book was I feel like they told you to just kind of forget everything you know about Agile and don't try to apply it to this.
Yeah.
And just read this with a blank mind and no assumptions, because you'll be fighting, kind of like you said, like trying to compare bets versus
always trying to map it against a familiar. And that's an unfortunate human behavior thing, is that so here's the thing. What my favorite developers that I've ever worked with, and some of the most profound people in both creating neat code and great products more than code, they don't come from a traditional CS background. Quite often they come from liberal arts, behavioral psychology, different areas, or they're self-taught. So the only reason they coded was to get something done versus learning the beauty and the science of code, which I love people. We need those scientists of code out there. But when you want product builders, you need somebody who can just shake off all the methodologies and say, I think we can do this. Let's just figure out how to get it done.
That's so true. That's so true. I mean, I don't have a computer science degree. I got about a half of a mechanical engineering degree because I love math, but that's so accurate. And, I will say throughout my 8-year career in software now, I think there have been maybe 3 times that I wished I had some kind of computer science background.
Right.
Where I had to like dig through articles and read really dense things to kind of, figure out some very complicated database issue,
Yeah.
But the majority of the time it's absolutely unnecessary. And really, like, this world moves so fast. Universities cannot, there's no way they can keep up.
No. And the curriculum needs to be tested. So even if they're right for a test period, and which means it's 5 years old at a minimum, right?
Yeah. And 5 years ago, God, React was brand new 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, if you're teaching React now as it was 5 years ago, like, you're teaching the wrong curriculum.
Yeah. Well, and it used to be, and that was like I find now, I think it's getting better in that we're seeing more injection from the tech organizations are feeding into the university system to create opportunity to like get funding into it. And I mean, this is also one where I'm always torn because I believe it's true, right? I'm a free market kid at heart. And I know, unfortunately, part of the free market is that the people with the money are going to influence a bit the behaviors of the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
So some people really push back and say, well, no, I don't want, a Microsoft or an Oracle or, a VMware or whoever, AWS influencing, their products into the educational system. And I more think of it as, you want the 2,000 kids to come out of here with a workable skill that they can immediately get a job for, or do you want them to learn touring and then have to figure out how to program in full stack, when they get out the other side?
Yeah, well, that's a real problem, right? I think a lot of people are recognizing that automation is a real problem.
Yeah.
It's not here yet. But give it another 20, 30 years, we have to have a scalable way to train people to use these technologies, because so many jobs are going to go away. Others will be created, but
right.
But we have to have a system that can train people to work in these new industries and new jobs, and the university system as it stands, in my opinion, is doesn't work for this model. So yeah, like who's gonna dump all that money in? It's gonna have to be these big companies.
What's funny too about when you come at it from a non-backgrounded, approach. I don't have a university degree. I don't have, whatever would lead me to the start point. The fact that you don't have any presumptions or assumptions about anything helps you to really have a true first principles approach. You're like, I don't have anything that's influenced me to get to here. So how can I possibly be incrementally improving? As far as I'm concerned, this life is an etch-a-sketch. And I'm just going to say, like, I have no idea how to do this. When I wrote code in high school for like my high school, comp sci class, the professor, he looked at it and he goes, this works. And I have no idea why you did it this way, but it works. So I'm going to give you the mark, but you probably don't want to do this as a job. And it turns out I'm dyslexic and have dyscalculia, and I've got all sorts of exciting, weirdness in my own brain that keeps me from being good at programming. But I'm also like a bloody raccoon trying to chase a shiny object inside a hole of a tree, and I will die with my arm stuck to it. So I'm willing to kind of keep grinding at it, which is why I still code. And I do need, because if I keep testing and it gets better. It does get better as you practice it and put those in and find the use case and build for the use case. Not just like, it's like, I'm a guitarist and I can play all sorts of stuff on guitar. Can't read music, can't sight read.
Me either.
And if I actually went back to try and learn how to sight read, and it's horrifying because I was like, I just wanted to get to playing. And so, and I see, so there it is, right? Like you have the same thing and you find other folks. When I talk to other founders, I talk to other folks, and you see these patterns. We all have sort of commonalities, like formal school system doesn't generally map, right? That's why the Thiel Foundation pulls them out at high school and says, don't even start college, kid. I'm just going to pay you to build a company.
Yeah. You used a word there that really, resonated with me, and that was iteration, right? So, what you described about that code you wrote in high school, you're probably not giving yourself enough credit. I feel that way about every piece of code I write. The initial implementation of anything shouldn't be guided by frameworks like that, or these even things that you've done before. And how can I build this feature and get it in the hands of customers and create value as soon as possible? If the code works, fantastic, great.
Yeah.
And if that MVP that took you 4 hours to write, because you just like hacked it out in a super ugly way that your later self is going to look at and wonder, what you were on that day. If that works and no one ever asks for any improvements on the feature, it's a win, right? Like you didn't obsess trying to fit it into this world of pretty code and domain driven design and whatever buzzword you want to throw out there. You delivered value and it works, and you don't have to worry about it until you need to iterate on it again, right? Okay, now someone wants to add this. Okay, maybe now we clean it up a little bit because it's going to provide more value now. So I would caution against people being afraid to write ugly code or giving themselves a hard time about it.
Well, and even I can say it honestly. I've seen organizations move around and people come and go, and it's normal, right? And so you hire the greatest developer, and we tout their code, and they create great products, and it works. And then the next developer will come in, and they're gonna be like, "Who wrote this?" Like, and they will then start to have to back into a bunch of weird code because there's personalization that makes its way into the way we write code, and so no matter how good it is, somebody else will be different enough that it may seem better, but it's just different.
Right. I mean, don't over-engineer something if a simple if-then else statement will work, right? Because that's going to be easy for anyone to look at and understand what's happening, right?
I laughed at it. I talked to Brian LaRue. If you're in the Ruby on Rails community, you may have bumped into Brian along the way somewhere. And fantastic Rails developer is a company called Begin, works in the serverless frameworks on AWS. Really cool. And it was funny. He's like, I look back on code that I wrote 6 months ago. He's somewhat like, I'm horrified. I don't even know who wrote it sometimes. He's like, that's kind of how it should be, is that you should be it should get the thing done. And then as you get better, maybe you go back and clean some stuff up, he says, but you should always be you should just be learning and adapting and growing, but getting the thing done. Like, the MVP, the V is the important part. It's viable. It does something.
Right.
It achieves the result.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't, circling back to university training, you don't need that. You just need to know the bare minimum to make something work and provide business value. And you're going to iterate, and you're going to be iterating on your own knowledge as you go, and as you're actually building something that's in people's hands that they're using. There's no better classroom than that.
So what is a moment where you really questioned whether you were doing the right thing?
In my company?
Yeah, because I know, given the way you describe yourself, you've got a very good introspective ability, probably too good, that I would say at some point along the way, you probably thought, okay, am I heading in the right direction? I'm just curious when it's happened and how you got through it.
Yeah. So I would say after 1 year, after 1 year of coding in my spare time on Fermentable, I got it to a point where I was able to put it into some breweries' hands. And that felt great. It was scary at the same time. And they liked it. There was a lot of positive feedback, but there was also about 10 pages of feature requests. Right? Yeah. And so I was like, I can't do this by myself. Right. Yeah. So I brought on a co-founder. His name is Frank West. He was part of a Ruby community in Fresno, where I kind of came up as a Rubyist. And he was also a home brewer. So we had a lot in common. And he seemed excited to work on it. And so I brought him on as a co-founder, because we really, even though it was founded, it wasn't really founded yet.
Yeah.
And so fast forward 2 years of having him on board. But me being the one that kind of lured him in, so to speak, I think we had about 10 paying customers in 2 years. 2 years of not full-time effort, but pretty good effort on both of our parts. And we had about 10 customers. And I was just like, what are we doing? Like, what am I doing to him? and his family, right? Like I drug him into this thing. Like we are legally, bound to this company. Even though it's an LLC, it's a much looser binding, but it's still, something. And I had about 6 months of just like deep reflection, like what am I doing? How, do I just quit? Do I just throw the towel in? Because we only have 10 customers, like it'll be disappointing for them, but what are you going to do? Companies fail, right?
Right.
Or do we keep grinding? And I just like, I had to do a lot of soul searching. It was like, is this the thing I want to keep doing? And I can't tell you what got me through it and where the decision was made, because again, like it was a good solid 6 months of me. Like we didn't really work on the product at all. We just kind of maintained it. And for some reason, the beginning, actually, I do know what it is, and I don't know why it happened. So this was about 3 years ago. Beginning of the year, the month of January and February, we brought on like 25 new customers all at once. They just like came out of the woodwork, and I was like, oh my God, wow. And that kind of got us excited again. It got us building new features again. And we've been on a slow but steady increase ever since. And then that's when the company like started making money and getting money in the bank, which allowed us to kind of, go to a conference, go to the Craft Brewers Conference in Denver. We did that 2 years ago for the first time, and made a lot of connections and started getting really excited again about the industry. And we were actually talking to brewers face to face. And so that really was the moment. That was after about 18 months. It was probably 18 months after I was first starting to think about just like giving up. And once we did that, that's when I knew like there's no reason for me to give up on this. I know I'm doing the right thing. Like it took that kettle's getting some money injected from new customers and seeing a constant slow growth and being like deep in the industry and talking to people and commiserating with industry professionals is what really did it for me, because it brought back my passion for beer. I kind of lost that. And so really getting in there brought it back for me. And at this point, we're both fairly happy. We don't work on it a ton, but we're excited to add new features when we do. And it's just slowly growing. And, maybe in another 10 years, we'll be able to retire and just be full-time Fermentable employees. But, we're very much interested in the DHH and Jason Fried approach, where we're happy to just kind of cruise along until we find our happy spot.
Well, that's it. It's respectable.
Yeah.
It's something that people don't often have the willingness to understand, is that that peer recognition and like the just being able to be among your peers is huge. Like that, I think founders, I hear stories like this all the time, and there's a real theme to this. Like you get so wrapped into so much introspection that you just can't get away from it. And it's when you get out, I mean, even just as simple as I was talking with somebody earlier about, this will be my 163rd podcast. I think this one, when it goes out, and I stopped at like 40 for about 5 months. And what made me think about it was I'm like, oh, I should go and look up. I'm like, I think it's on iTunes. For a reason, I looked at it and I saw a bunch of comments, and it said like, I love that this is just like it's like a conversation that I would love to be involved in. And I was like, oh man, I got to start doing this again, because I'm like, that's why I did this. That's why I did this damn thing in the first, like, and it's like, you need like, no, it's really hard to be completely self-sustaining as a founder. In fact, I think it's impossible. And that's getting out into a community, getting out amongst your peers, getting out and getting that real validation that people go like, hey, Darren, I really dig what you guys are doing. And let's see if we can get ourselves signed up. And like all of a sudden you're like, man, that's right. that's why I'm here. That's why we did this thing, you know?
That's why I forgot. Yeah, it's really easy to lose sight of why you started it. You know, when I started it, I had a very clear vision. I was scratching an itch. I was very excited about it. But yeah, you know, you get into the grind and
there's no business book about the middle.
Yeah.
I think this is the thing. There's tons of books about getting started and your first year. And then you've got all these books about hyper growth and strategies that have been implemented by Reid Hoffman and, you know, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. You're like, okay, cool. Love it. Not mapping to my business. That's going to be a Basecamp style of growth, which is what I want, which is why I love, you know, the writings and readings, and you hear people that are in that space. Like there is no room, there's no library of our stories of like, fantastically in the middle, I'll call it.
Oh yeah. I would be profoundly happy if we could grow this business to $1 to $2 million ARR.
Yeah.
Like if we could hit that, like I would be so happy like that.
Yeah.
I don't need any more than that. Like that would be a really sweet spot for us, you know? So.
Well, Darren, I predict that you're going to see that number. It comes from you, you know, it comes from your co-founder. It comes from why you do it. Right. And it's my true belief that, you know, somewhere in the line between karma, science, and hard ass work, it all comes together. And, you know, you stuck it through and you got through that period, and that's what'll get you to that next phase. And I definitely see that, you know, what you're doing and the passion you have for doing it and the approach of you're mindful of the cost of doing it too. So you're not going to spend into growth and, you know, unless necessary, right? It's a rare combination of a founder to be able to have what you've got and, you know, I don't know the official word, we'll call it stick-to-itiveness, but like just be willing to, you know, keep going and do it because you love it.
Persistence and patience. Those are the two things.
One day we'll be looking back and it is going to be, we'll call it, it'll be my path to 2 million ARR by Darin Haener.
There you go. There you go. All right. Yeah. Well, we're going to sign the book deal.
The long path to overnight success, which is also what I really
that's great. I like that. The long path to overnight success. That's
I've seen, you know, when we read these books and hear these stories and you see, like, of course we have to take out all the unexciting stuff and all the really hard stories and get to the, like, you know, really neat things, you know, chaos monkeys, like fantastic stories and fantastic people that have done these things. But that's what people think that running a company is. It's that it's an 8-chapter book that has a happy ending.
Right. And everyone on the outside just sees the conclusion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They just see it as building towards an exit. And that's the other thing too, you know, when you talk about taking on funding, the reason why those people will invest is because they see an exit. They're not in it like Warren Buffett for the long game. They're in it for the life of the fund, which has a 10-year span.
Yep. Totally right. Yeah. So.
If anybody needed advice on why not to take on venture funding, read his Secrets of Sand Hill by Scott Kupor, because he's very open about why it's a tough thing and the responsibility you have in taking it on. And Scott, of course, is from, you know, sort of the OG of Sand Hill Road venture capitalists. Really, really well done book. And yeah, like the moment I read through it, I was like, I'm never taking on venture funding if I start my own company.
Well, I've already made that decision, but I could always use more validation on the subject. Yeah, so I'll definitely check that one out.
But Darren, this is fun. I really thank you very much for sharing all these you know, good insights, and I really truly want to see the success of Fermentable and you and the team. This is going to be neat to see, and like I said, we'll have you back on when you crack that 2 million. But in the meantime, like I said, thank you for really being open about, the neatness of it, and also for unpacking the brewing industry, which is that's something we don't get a chance to do often.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for having me. It was a blast, and glad we got to talk about beer.
That's it. Yeah. Somewhere amongst all this, we got to talk a bunch about beer. And so there you go. People got to learn about why we call it an IPA. So awesome. Yeah. Well, Darren, so if people want to reach you, what's the best way online or in other ways that they can get a hold of you?
Yeah, online, www.getfermentable.com. You can email me directly at Darin, DARIN, at getfermentable.com. We can answer any questions you have about the brewing industry, or if you need some software, we're happy to help you out. Or if you just want to chat technology, I'm always happy to do that too.
Nice. So thank you very much for that, Darren. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
Stop my recording here.